I think they fixed the problem. So Director May, please go ahead.
Good morning, good afternoon, greetings to all participants. On behalf of Bureau for Free Trade, I would like to welcome all of you to join the web Service and Climate Change, the role and opportunities have today and tomorrow. Extreme climate affects our daily life. Issues related to climate change have attracted our attention more than ever. Government and private sectors have made efforts and taken actions in response to the impact of climate change. In the past, we focused more on how manufacturing could reduce carbon emissions and a few discussions on the role of services in combating climate change. Nevertheless, in the WTO and in the APEC, people have already started their work. For example, a group of like-minded WTO members, including New Zealand, Australia, Switzerland, have launched talks since 2019 on market access for environmental services. In June, APEC trade ministers have reaffirmed their commitment to support trade in environmental-related services. And some countries are working hard to promote environmental goods and services in agreements, such as the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability. Today, we are pleased to have speakers from WTO Secretariat and from Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade of New Zealand and the Office of Climate Change, Environmental Potential Administration from Taiwan, and also scholars from Australia and Taiwan to join us. They will share their views on climate change, draw from their observation of public policies. Tomorrow, speakers from private sectors will share their experiences and thoughts on the opportunities and the challenges faced by services providers. I believe all these presentations and discussions will help us to better understand how the role and opportunities faced by service sectors in combating climate change. Thanks a lot to all our speakers and the participants. We welcome everyone to join us today and tomorrow and look forward to a fruitful meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director May. It is an honor for me to have this opportunity to chair today's event. As Director May have already mentioned, climate change have brought on many challenges for our contemporary societies. For service and industry, services and climate change have a mutual impact on each other. For example, the environmental changes brought on by climate change will have a varying degree of impact, both positive and negative, on different service sectors and for different regions. And on the other hand, service industries is not a low-carbon industry as many people thought it was. Depending on how we define the scope of service industry, as well as different sectors are concerned, emission of CO2s and other greenhouse gases from the service sector can account for almost 20% of the global emissions. It really depends on how you define the service sector in different research piece. All these show the importance of taking climate change, mitigation, and adaptation measures into consideration in the service sector. Meanwhile, another challenge brought by climate change to the service industry relates to the definition and classification of so-called climate change-related services. The current system of classification, such as the W/120 or CPC system, does not have a corresponding service sector called climate change, and even a very relevant sector called environmental sector does not include all the activities that relate to climate change. So economic activities or industries realities that relate to climate change mitigation and adaptation can include a wide range of service sector. This challenge might hamper the ability to include market access of climate change related services in new regional and multilateral trade agreement. All these complicated interactions and issues have brought forward the urgent need to identify the role and opportunities of the service sector in the climate change era, in particular the temporary call for achieving a net zero society. But luckily today we have a superb panel of experts who can provide a clear answer to all these daunting issues. We have Ms. Pellin from the WTO Secretariat, who can offer us a perspective from a multilateral perspective. And then we have Mr. Samuel Ria from New Zealand. Mr. Ria is responsible for negotiation on environmental related services in one of the very promising regional agreement, ACEC-TS. So I believe that presentations from both these practitioners can offer us a better understanding on how the service, climate change related services and its role in trade agreement and trade negotiations. Sorry? Okay, I thought I hear some intervention. And then we have the honor to have Dr. Lin Yi-Cai, the Director General of Taiwan's EPA, and she is responsible for Taiwan's environmental related issues, in particular greenhouse gas legislation and drafting a legal framework for Taiwan's net zero path. Last but not least, we have Professor Mike Young, who is a research chair from the University of Adelaide. In the IPCC report, water sector is one of the sectors that have been identified as having as a sector that would receive a very negative impact from climate change. So we are very glad to have Professor Young's perspective on this issue. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Pellin. Ms. Pellin, you have the floor, please.
Oh, thank you very much for this introduction. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I would first like to thank the organizer, the Taiwan Coalition of Services Industries, for their invitation to participate in this event. The topic on the nexus between services and climate change is timely. The findings of the recent report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are clear. Unless there are immediate and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to close to 1.5 degrees Celsius or even 2 degrees Celsius will be beyond reach. At COP26 next month, UNFCCC parties will be gathering to discuss more ambitious targets to curb greenhouse gas emissions. They will also be addressing climate finance and rules to implement the Paris Agreement. And so this obviously provides background for discussions that look into the role of trade and trade policies in advancing climate mitigation and adaptation goals and sustainable development goals. And the interface of trade and climate change has also been gaining traction rapidly in the WTO. Now, the relationship between trade and climate change is obviously a complex one. Trade is an important contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, as it involves the production, movement, and consumption of goods and services, both within and across borders. Trade is also directly affected by climate change. It can be severely disrupted by the impacts of extreme weather events, and these impacts are being felt for instance, on transport and logistics infrastructure. And we know that the frequency of such events will only increase with global warming. But trade can also play an important role in accelerating climate action and in promoting sustainable development. Trade and trade policies can and must be part of the solution because they have major potential to support global sustainability goals. Now, issues at the interface of trade and the environment are not new at the WTO. And in fact, members have been discussing these issues for a great number of years. But two new initiatives were launched last year by groups of like-minded countries. One initiative is an informal dialogue on plastics pollution. And the second initiative, which is relevant to the theme that we are discussing today, is structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability, the so-called TWCSI initiative. Now, the mandate of this TWCSI initiative is to intensify discussions at the WTO on a broad range of issues, including the linkages between trade and climate change. These discussions explore how trade policy can help address climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts and the Sustainable Development Goals more broadly. And one pathway is by facilitating access to climate-related goods, services, and technologies. Much work has been done already in the WTO on environmental goods and services, but the work has focused mainly on the goods aspect. There were plurilateral negotiations for an environmental goods agreement, which were suspended in 2016. But through these negotiations and also through negotiations that preceded the launch of this plurilateral process, negotiations that took place in the context of the Doha round, there has been significant progress on the issue of environmental goods, but less progress on the issue of environmental services. And we have seen over the recent years a renewed interest to focus on environmental services, not just in the context of the TWCSI initiative that I just mentioned, but also in the standing body of the WTO that deals with services market access, which is the Council for Trade and Services in special session. In that context, a group of members have advanced their interest in improving commitments, market access commitments in the environmental services sector. Now, the sector has grown considerably over the years. It is an important sector of world services trade. Global trade in clean tech, for which environmental services play an important role, has nearly doubled between 2008 and 2015. And it was estimated at $1.15 trillion in exports in 2015. And the demand for environmental services has also been booming and will continue to grow as countries adopt more stringent environmental policies and regulations to address increasingly pressing environmental challenges. The demand for environmental services is also driven by private sector actors that have pledged to take action and are pledging to take action to improve their environmental performance, either by reducing emissions or by improving the reusability or recyclability of their products, for instance. Promoting trade liberalization and cooperation in environmental services could create opportunities for businesses in both developed and developing countries to integrate into global value chains because of the localized nature of environmental services. Trade in climate-related services allows firms to source the services that they need from foreign suppliers at more competitive prices. And by improving access to technologies that support mitigation and adaptation goals, trade can also contribute to lower the costs of implementing climate-friendly policies. The uptake of climate-friendly technologies can help create jobs as well. For instance, in the supply of services related to the installation and maintenance of relevant products and infrastructure. The commitments undertaken by WTO members in the environmental services sector are relatively modest compared to commitments undertaken in other services sectors. And most of these commitments date back to the late 1990s when environmental protection was less of a concern. More extensive and ambitious commitments on environmental services and on climate change in particular have also been undertaken in the context of RTAs. Over the years, new technologies have opened a range of opportunities to provide environmental services on a cross-border basis. And these include, for instance, technologies that enable the remote monitoring of environmental infrastructure, technologies that collect data on air and water quality, or technologies that measure wind velocity, for instance, if we think of wind energy. Cross-border trade, which corresponds to trade under Mode 1, as it is defined under the GATS, could therefore benefit from enhanced liberalization in this sector. But improved commitments could also contribute to improving the conditions in which suppliers of environmental services can establish or maintain a commercial presence abroad. They could also make it easier for environmental specialists, engineers, or other professionals with particular skills or expertise that may not be readily available in a country to travel to that country for the purpose of supplying these services. So there are many incentives to reinvigorate the work on environmental services in the WTO. At the same time, as Director May pointed out in her introduction, there are a number of issues that members have grappled with in earlier negotiations, and that will warrant further consideration in order to advance the work in this area. And I will mention only two of them here. The first question relates to the identification of services that may qualify as environmental services. There is no universally agreed definition for environmental services, and there are no criteria either that have been agreed, at least among members in the WTO, to guide this discussion. Implementing solutions to address the climate crisis and to advance sustainable development goals will undoubtedly require a broad range of services. These services may relate to the monitoring of air pollution, technical testing and analysis, the repair and maintenance of environmental products, and of course, engineering, construction, and advisory services, for instance, to improve energy efficiency of buildings and infrastructure, or to support renewable energy solutions. Circular economy approaches can also contribute to carbon neutrality by favoring the reuse and refurbishing of products, and services that support circular economy objectives may therefore be relevant. And such services may include, for instance, repair and maintenance of products, but also the collection, treatment, and disposal of waste. So clearly, there is a broad range of services that could be considered to support sustainability goals and climate mitigation and adaptation goals more specifically, and determining the scope of environmental or climate-related services, as the case may be, will require, as I said, further examination, further discussions in the WTO. The second question that I would like to highlight here is this complementarity between environmental goods and environmental services. Environmental solutions are, as we know, often delivered as a package that includes both goods and services. The respective share of goods and services in the total value of this package may vary. But interestingly, there is evidence that in some cases, services account for the largest part of the total value of environmental solutions. One example that was put forward actually by Chinese Taipei in the Committee on Trade and Environment a few years ago is the example of offshore wind power, of the offshore wind power industry. And Chinese Taipei observed that the value added of the goods component, namely the wind turbines, contributed only 1/3 of the total value compared to the services component, which consisted mainly of offshore maritime engineering and system engineering, which represented the remaining 2/3 of the offshore wind power value. But irrespective of the respective share of environmental goods and environmental services, the complementarity between the two means that greater liberalization of environmental services could also contribute favorably to the environmental goods market by allowing firms to source the specific knowledge and skills that they require from abroad. Developing a better understanding also of the barriers to the dissemination of both climate-related services and related goods will therefore be an important part of the work going forward. So this in particular, this question of the identification of barriers to trade in environmental services and environmental goods and the dissemination of green technologies, this is an area that could certainly benefit from input from stakeholders, including from the private sector. The TESID initiative includes a multi-stakeholders dialogue that is intended to channel the knowledge and expertise from the business community, but also civil society, international organizations, and academic institutions on the various topics that are covered under this initiative. So to conclude, there is momentum building in the WTO around the issues relating to the nexus of trade and climate change. There is interest in better understanding how trade and climate policies can be mutually supportive and how trade can be a key enabler of the transition towards a climate neutral and more resource efficient global economy. The work on environmental goods and services in particular has been identified as a priority area for action by the participants of the TESID initiative. And one can expect that the work on this topic will intensify over the coming months and post the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference that will take place end of November and beginning of December. And the business community and other stakeholders will have in this context an opportunity to share their views on these important issues and should definitely seize that opportunity going forward. So I will leave it at that for now, and I look forward to answering any questions in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pallant, for giving us an overall view, first of all, on trade and climate change, and then on the evolution of trade and environmental issues in the WTO. In particular, one of the trade and environment negotiation agenda under the Doha round on trade and environment, that is the liberalization of trade in environmental goods and services. And also, Ms. Pallant gave us an overview on the WTO work that helps to address the issues of trade, climate change, and sustainability. Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Mr. Samuel Rea from New Zealand. Mr. Rea, you have the floor, please.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening, and thank you for the introduction, and also thank you for the opportunity to speak today. This is a really interesting topic, and one that New Zealand takes a keen interest in. Climate change and a transition to a more sustainable development is an extremely important topic, not only in New Zealand, but globally. And this evening I will provide you with an overview of New Zealand's views on key environmental services related issues, as well as New Zealand's current trade initiatives that we're seeking to explore. So on the role of services, we see services as playing an essential role in global trade through both the pure services delivery and as an enabler of trading goods. This role is also growing as new technologies come online and new ways of doing things are established. This means services has the potential to play a unique role in efforts to address climate change and a transition to more sustainable development. Addressing these two issues will involve speeding up the transition away from fossil fuels towards cleaner forms of energy, improving sanitation such as decontaminating waste, upgrading resilience to natural disasters, and protecting vulnerable natural areas. This will inevitably involve a heavy reliance on environmental goods, but will also require services to play a role in the delivery of these goods, in addition to the role of services in creating environmentally friendly infrastructure. The role of environmental goods and services that they play in addressing climate change is well established, as Marie-Isabelle alluded to earlier, and it's well recognised that trade and environmental services can play a key role in addressing climate change. But in New Zealand's view, to be able to realise the potential that environmental services can play in addressing climate change, the liberalisation and removal of barriers to trade and environmental services is crucial. New Zealand sees the first step in this process as being redefining what is considered to be an environmental service. And trade agreements such as the GATS have used the Central Product Classification for determining what is an environmental service, and Division 94, obviously titled Environmental Service, includes the more traditional view of those services. And while undoubtedly benefiting the environment, the environmental services sector has progressed significantly since the negotiation of the GATS, and now encapsulates a wide variety of services. But it is difficult to determine which services should be considered part of a cluster of environmental or environmentally related services. And the purpose of these services can remain prone to subjectivity. For example, construction services could be utilised to build a wind-powered electricity plant, but equally could be used for the construction of a coal-powered electricity plant. Both have the same end goal, which is to create electricity, but the impact on the environment is vastly different. Despite these challenges, New Zealand sees it as important that environmental services be seen as a broader group or cluster of services that serve to benefit or improve the environment. And we consider that the expansion of what is considered environmental service being the first step in realising this. A wider definition and the removal of barriers to trade based on that expanded definition would help to keep costs of pollution prevention and control low and preserve efficiency and competitiveness in the market. This would enable greater uptake of services that contribute to beneficial environmental outcomes through greater access to these services. It is also important to note the potential benefits to developing economies having greater access to these services at lower costs. So in terms of what New Zealand is doing, we are committed to working on these issues in a number of forums and have two main streams of work underway. The first is the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, or the ACS, which has been mentioned previously. And this is a key part of New Zealand's approach in addressing climate change through trade. So the ACS is an agreement that is being negotiated between Costa Rica, Fiji, Iceland, Norway, New Zealand and Switzerland, and covers four main areas, being environmental services, environmental goods, eco-labelling and fossil fuel subsidy reform. Once negotiations of the ACS are complete, it will be open for all WTO members to join. The environmental services pillar is a key part of this agreement, with an overarching aim to establish new and binding commitments on environmental services. New commitments in environmental services will provide certainty for service providers to operate in offshore markets, which will enable greater access to these services and new technologies, and thereby encouraging uptake. This work will include identifying and agreeing on a list of environmental services and environmentally related services that captures the expansive and innovative environmental services sector. As I've outlined earlier, the work will expand on the definition of environmental services beyond the existing CPC 94 framework. As part of this process, the participants have recognised the challenge posed in addressing dual use, where a service may be able to both benefit the environment and harm it depending on the context, such as the construction example I mentioned earlier, and are looking to establish criteria to help us develop the list to ensure that these issues are addressed. This is a challenge and something we are working to resolve to ensure certainty and predictability within the agreement. The second work stream that New Zealand is focusing on is leading work in the led by New Zealand has commissioned a report to look at issues related to environmental services, which was titled Environmental Services in the APEC Region, Definition, Challenges and Opportunities. Following this report, New Zealand has led work developing a reference list of environmental services that will also seek to expand the definition of environmental services beyond CPC 94. While this list will be non-binding and a reference list in nature, New Zealand sees the development of this list as an important step in the process of broadening global views and thinking on how services can contribute to efforts to address climate change. APEC has shown before that it can act as an incubator of ideas. New Zealand hopes to tap into this to allow this idea to spread further than just APEC. New Zealand has also been encouraged by the discussions happening in the WTO and hopes that this reference list being created in APEC can add to these discussions as we seek a multilateral outcome in relation to trade and environmental issues, as Maria Isabel has mentioned earlier. I will leave my comments there, but I hope this has provided an overview of New Zealand's views on issues related to environmental services and highlighted a couple of areas where we're seeking to respond to these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ria, for the very clear presentation on New Zealand's approach on environmental services. And I believe that the audiences will be very interested in two of the initiatives New Zealand is undertaking. One is the negotiation of agreement on climate change and trade and sustainability, and also the list of illustrative list of environmental services in the APEC region, because the APEC also had a environmental goods list previously that guided the WTO's EGA's work in the early days. So I believe that New Zealand's effort in redefining the content and classification of environmental services will be very crucial in this area. Now we have our third presenter, Dr. Cai Yiling. Dr. Cai is the Director General of Office of Climate Change, Environmental Protection Administration in Taiwan. So, Dr. Cai, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Professor Shi, and good afternoon and good morning, everyone. It's my honor to have a brief introduction of Taiwan's overall climate strategies. And now I have a short slide here. Oh, okay. For starters, the topic of most concern this year is net zero emissions. Before discussing this issue, we must pay attention to and understand Taiwan's current actual greenhouse gas emission status. At the same time, under the principle of equity and common but differentiated responsibility and the respective capabilities, although Taiwan shares the responsibility for global carbon reduction, it currently accounts for only 0.56% of global greenhouse gas emissions. According to the National Inventory Report, the net greenhouse gas emissions is about 266 million tons in 2019. Among them, 95% of emission comes from carbon dioxide, and the emission of fuel combustion accounts for 90%. In Taiwan, due to the effort we put in the greenhouse gas management, the decoupling between the economic growth and the carbon dioxide emission from fuel combustion occurred around 2007. After that, the total emission have been controlled to a certain level and have not increased again. We can find that till 2019, Taiwan achieved a 64% GDP growth rate. Meanwhile, the carbon emission intensity dropped to 40% from base year 2005. The greenhouse gas emission control action programs are essential methods to regulate actions and improve mitigation goals by sectors. Indeed, as you can realize that the energy sector and the manufacturing sector are most important. The manufacturing sectors account for 52%, and the energy sector accounts for 13%. The residential and the commercial sectors accounts for 20%, and 12% comes from the transportation. In response to the global trends, our President Tsai and the Premier Su all declared net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Before we propose an amended draft, a task force for assessing the roadmap is formed for clarifying our capability and the modeling technology potential. The Executive Yuan organized the cross-ministry task force with EPA, MOEA, and many departments in this roadmap assessment framework. Vigilance task force ensure all stakeholders' consensus, while the modeling task force manages scientific-based technology assessment towards 2050. There are 5 discussion groups are also formed in response to specific topics. And the governance group, which is organized by the EPA, and we will discuss the carbon pricing and the governance. In July 2015, Taiwan enacted the Greenhouse Gas Reduction and the Management Act, which legalized a 50% emissions reduction target for 2050 compared to 2005 greenhouse gas levels. As I mentioned in previous slides, Our new roadmap is to conduct net zero emissions by 2050. Several key strategies of technologies must be applied on time to ensure the goal is achievable, such as renewable energy, hydrogen energy, energy efficiency, CCUS, circular economy, transportation, electrification, social behavior change, and a massive carbon sink are all necessary to help us reach the goal by 2050. The Green Finance Action Plan 2.0 announced by the Financial Supervisory Commission, FSC, in 2020 was created to use financial mechanisms to increase the awareness of companies and the investors of environmental, social, and governance ESG issues, to foster a positive cycle of investment and the industry's pursuit of sustainable development, and to facilitate cooperation between the public and the private sectors to attain Taiwan's carbon reduction and the sustainable development goals. And you can see from the core strategies, and there are 8 implementation aspects. Not only the credit, investment, capital market fundraise, and we also have the promotion of further development of green financial products or service and the information disclosures. The FSC will implement 5 measures that aim to improve the quality, consistency, and the transparency of corporate ESG disclosures by amending related regulation and establishing integration platform so as to provide the financial market participants with comparable, reliable, and comprehensive information. As we all know, the carbon pricing system mainly includes carbon levy and carbon trading. According to International ETS emission trading scheme experience, most require annual greenhouse gas emission of 25,000 tons to be included in the trading system. In Taiwan, if we follow this standard, only about 300 entities will be included in the ETS. So this is a very small carbon trading market. And now we are formulate the relative, because we have the relative small size of the market and the concentrations of emissions in a small number of players could lead to challenges regarding the concentration of market power and the liquidity in secondary markets. So we are amended our Greenhouse Gas Act into Climate Change Act, and carbon levy is a new scheme in the amendment, rapidly applying to major emission sources in Taiwan. Especially, we have to understand that the top 30 greenhouse gas emission sources contributed to 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. And the carbon levy will be applied first to reflect carbon price. We will encourage the company and the entities to improve their industry and promoting the development of low carbon economies, and subsidize and rewarding for business investor in their greenhouse gas reduction technologies. In short, net zero emission by 2050 is our explicit goal, and the Taiwan government also commits to legalizing it. Carbon reduction is now a global trade issue. Taiwan is, we will promote the low carbon technology and the industries. And the EPA now is amending the Greenhouse Gas Reduction and the Management Act. So now we will expect to propose an advanced and amendment draft this month for collecting feedbacks. This is my short presentation about Taiwan's climate change strategy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tai, for giving us a clear review on Taiwan's overall greenhouse gas emission status, as well as our legal and policy response. And also, Dr. Tai mentioned a little bit on a particular service sector, i.e. the financial sector, where it is a crucial sector in helping to push forward climate change mitigation and adaptation effort by providing the adequate finance. Coming to a different service sector in responding to the challenges of climate change, we have our fourth speaker, Professor Young from University of Adelaide, who will give us also on putting a sector focus on the water sector. So Professor Yang, you have the floor, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I hope I can share my slides with you successfully without any problems. I wanted to focus today particularly on some of the challenges and really big issues. I work in water, and it's interesting in showing the strength where this has gone. For the last about 6 years, I've spent a lot of time working in the United States, supplying advice on how to improve water management. In the last 2 years, I've started working in Oregon, and I have never been to Oregon, but I've done a lot of consulting work, and I meet with people in Oregon using Zoom and Teams and other platforms at least once a week and often twice a week. So the system is changing, and this is global experience everywhere, as we're finding today. If I start by making some broad policy-related observations first. The first one is to observe that there is very, very strong interest in dealing with climate change. There are over 190 countries involved. And importantly, and this is often a mistake that's made in these negotiations, the focus is on 6 gas types, not just carbon. Many people think it's just about carbon reduction. It's about many gases, not just carbon. And importantly, for a trade perspective, each country sets its own emission reduction pathway. This makes me think carefully. If countries follow different reduction pathways, then they have trade advantages or disadvantages depending on which pathway they choose to follow. And clearly, trade liberalisation, as we've already heard, with full internalization of externalities can help. I could give you a long economics lecture, but now's not the time to do that. But let me draw attention to 3 important considerations. The first, that it's very common to find the use of subsidies, which are largely historic subsidies, but are still there to help regions produce coal, gas, petroleum, and to subsidise electricity. It's something which is done broadly and widely throughout much of the world, and there are important agendas about moving towards eliminating those subsidies. Secondly, there's a very important and emerging area, which is around grants and subsidies designed to expedite adoption of low emissions technologies. And in my own country, there is now massive interest in conducting what are called experiments at scale, which is code for subsidising the production of things like hydrogen at quite large scale. If countries do that, then those that do it first will get a competitive advantage, and there's a whole issue about how that game is played out. And thirdly, there are carbon taxes, emission trading schemes, and emissions controls, all designed to reduce emissions, and Taiwan's doing this. Australia is using various versions of it, and so is New Zealand. Once again, there's a very rich area there to trade in services. I would observe, lastly, in this broad area, first of all, that there is a massive international pressure for progress in this arena. And it's an arena where trade negotiators have been struggling to reach agreement. I'm impressed with actually New Zealand's approach of getting a small group of people together to try and sort out an agreement and then invite others to sign in. But it's an area where people are expecting rapid progress, as time is not on the world side in dealing with climate change. And as I work in water, it's very clear that climate change is having massive implications for the world quite quickly. A really good example of what has been happening is in the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which they're in the process of developing. They released their proposal in July of this year, and as part of their plan to get to net zero by 2050. It aims to create a level playing field and to prevent carbon leakage caused by the presence of their emissions trading scheme. And it requires exporters, people who might, for example, in Australia, try and sell iron ore or iron to Europe, to do that in a way which has either an equivalent carbon price signal or to purchase EU certificates. Interestingly, rather than covering all of the 63 sectors which are involved in the emissions trading scheme, they're proposing to start with only 5 sectors: cement, electricity, fertilisers, iron ore and steel and alumina. It's a very small set of the causes. And selecting another really important perspective is if Australia has an ETS of some sort or a carbon tax, the revenue would stay in Australia. But if Australia chooses not to do that, the revenue which is raised through this proposed system remains in Europe. I think there's some very important issues around that. The plan is to start reporting on emissions involved in traded goods in 2023 and full implementation of this scheme by 2026. This is a radical challenge to the whole global community in terms of trade and services, and there are many issues that flow from that. Can, for example, we start and envisage, as was in the original Kyoto Protocol, an opportunity to trade in emission reduction certificates and permits? This is a classic environmental service, and one which I think is very important to consider. Secondly, is there a role for an international agreement that establishes a suite of rules that ensure that trade expedites progress towards a net zero world? And how would you do that? Do you work with clubs of willing nations, as we've heard New Zealand is trying to do in some areas? Or do we imagine a rapid move towards an international agreement that tidies up how we're going to do this as the world rapidly moves towards emission reduction? And a lot of nations are now have committed to reduce emissions by 30, 40, 50 or 60% by 2030. This is, if it's going to be successful, is going to really challenge global trade networks on how we do things. And I see as part of this, as well as the work on definitions and looking about what happens, that we need to work out how to move towards dealing with what I've called here progress expediting subsidies, but essentially grants and subsidies used to encourage investment in low technology and identify progress towards the elimination of subsidies that impede progress. And can we have something like the producer subsidy equivalence framework that played such an important role in agriculture? Can we have a carbon subsidy equivalence data set and a discussions around how much progress is being made in eliminating subsidies and also ensuring consistency as governments race to assist people adopt new technologies? And what is the appropriate benchmark for this? Is it a straight line to net zero by 2050? Is it something else? There's a lot of work to be done very, very quickly if we're going to have trade playing a positive role in the race to net zero. In terms of some final comments I'd like to make, I think that trade negotiators run a risk of being seen a group of people who are impeding progress. I've really been struck by how quickly progress has been made around the Paris Agreement, and somehow we have to find a way to shape things so that the trade negotiators around the world are seen to be positive contributors rather than roadblocks to progress. A well-designed international agreement could, for example, have a ratchet mechanism that encourages greater progress and coverage. At the moment, as I said, Europe's first attempt at trying to establish a level playing field is dealing only with 5 sectors or 5 products. This could be expanded to include many more quite quickly. Is it possible to introduce a global mechanism for fair certificate trading in a way that deals with all the complexities around that led people to walk away from the Kyoto Protocol? I remind people that was the original vision, but it's no longer there. How do we bring in systems that don't use price signals, but instead use regulations? Australia, for example, has a requirement that a proportion of all of its greenhouse gas emissions from electricity are brought to zero by using renewable electricity. It's a regulation, not a price or a market signal. Do we place some limits on the use of what I've called expediting grants and subsidies? Do we encourage the removal of actually dirty subsidies? And what is the best way to distribute all of the revenue raised through things like Europe's CBAM? These are all very important issues, and I'd like to see a rapid progress. I'd like to suggest it's now time to start talking about how we encourage fair trade as we move forward and starting to scope an international agreement that aims to have agreement within the next 4 or 5 years. And if we can do that, then I think there is an important opportunity, having learned how to do this, to then move to actually address other resources like water, which is the area I've spent most of my time working in. But water resource use is something which is much more subtle and much more local. Climate change is truly a global issue. As I've said, and in closing, I'd like to stress that time is of the essence. The world is rapidly investing in a transition to low carbon, and it's going to have a massive effect on the way trade is conducted over the next 4 to 5 years, and expect some savage shocks unless we put a really good agreement in place quickly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for Professor Yang. Well, actually, you have given a very nice wrap-up presentation on the role of trade, as well as, for example, the trade community and trade rules on how to address the important issues of not only climate change, but also a very important topic nowadays on the EU's CBAM mechanism, which is also a heatedly debated topic here in Taiwan. So as some of our panelists are international trade lawyers, but we are not the bunch that does not respond to environmental challenges. We actually care a lot about how trade and issues like climate change can mutually support each other. That is how the WTO, as well as several new generations of FTA, have tried to incorporate issues that are of great concern on climate change and other sustainability issues. And thank you very much for the wrap-up presentation. Thanks a lot for all the 4 presenters. And now, well, I myself have many questions that would like to ask our panelists, but I think you've seen from the WebEx chat room that audiences have some questions for our panelists. Well, the first question is that some developing countries argue that the WTO should focus more on regional development than environmental issues. Can you suggest persuasive arguments to gain more support from developing countries? Well, since the question relates to WTO, maybe Ms. Pellin would like to take up this question, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. This is the question of the participation of developing countries in this whole discussion on environmental goods and services is obviously a very central one. In the context of the discussions on environmental services in the Council for Trade and Services in special session, there have been concerns raised, of course, by developing countries about about focusing on market access aspects in relation to environmental services, but also in relation to other services sectors that have been identified as areas of interest by members in that body. The TESID process is obviously a multilateral, not a multilateral process, but a plurilateral one, as it is led by a group of like-minded members. But I think it will be important nonetheless in the context of this process to try and broaden the participation of other members as much as possible. So this is again a very pertinent question and one that will have to be taken on board by the participants in this initiative and more generally in the discussions on environmental services.
Okay, thank you very much for this very precise and realistic answers. The second question is that some people think that the discussion of energy-related services overlaps with environmental services in the WTO. What are your views on that? Well, the question touches upon the scope of environmental services or energy-related services. But maybe Mr. Samuel Ria can give us some view on, from your perspective and from your work on environmental services, what is the coverage or what is the relationship between maybe energy-related services and environmental services?
Sure. Thank you for the question. And it is a good one. And obviously, energy-related services can become quite a controversial topic, particularly in relation to environmental issues where we're looking at environmentally damaging forms of non-renewable energy. So I think from New Zealand's perspective, we have looked into the issue of how energy-related services and environmental services overlap, and there is certainly some clear overlap in terms of renewable energy, such as hydro or wind. And it is important, I think, that we recognise that there is a contribution there that those services can make, and the greater liberalisation of those services can certainly lead to far more a greater uptake in renewable energy and also help to expand global knowledge as those ideas begin to head around the world due to the liberalisation. So I think that energy-related services should certainly be a focus in discussions on expanding how we view environmental services and certainly can play an important role in that. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much for the very concise answer to this question. Well, the next question relates to the link between technological innovation and global climate change. It asks that how can technology help combat climate change? Well, the question is not addressed to any particular panelist, but I believe our technology guy, Professor Young, can you provide some answers, or in particular from the perspective of water resource management? Thank you.
Very much so. As we're talking about what are often called soft technologies, which are management systems and management techniques, which are part of the services agenda. And finding ways to share those is very, very important. And they're very important issues over IP and how that's done, and also how systems are managed globally. It's now possible to operate and manage a system from a different part of the world. So we're seeing rapid change, rapid adoption of new things. So opening up the services sector is particularly important. As I said, the work that I'm doing now in the United States, I used to have to do by getting a visa. Now all I need is the same computer I'm using tonight to talk to people, and they pay me for the work I do in America by sitting in Australia.
Well, that's a very good point in the sense that technology can be a media for a lot of works that can be done. Well, they used to have to travel, and some of the analysis also put this perspective on the mode of trade, service trade, especially in climate change and environmental related services. In some of the members' schedules, a lot of the members put an extra mark on Mode 1, where it says that technologically impossible. But for technological advances, there are certain, for example, consultation services or engineering services that can provide climate change or environmental related services actually via, for example, remote sensing, where you do not have to physically cross the border to offer services. So I believe that not only do we have to redefine the scope and classification of environmental services, somehow the mode of trading services would also have to be reconsidered when we think about technological innovation. Thank you, Professor Yang, for this answer. The next question relates to market access environmental services. The audience has asked that some members, when they are during discussion on market access for environmental services, some members ask for more detailed statistics, but resources on relevant statistics is still lacking. Can you share some best practice on gathering statistics? Maybe Ms. Pellin from the WTO Secretariat viewpoint can give us some feedback on how, for example, how the Secretariat can help with this issue.
The question of availability of trade statistics on statistics on trade and environmental services is indeed a real challenge for this sector. It relates to some extent to the fact that, this information is not readily available from member countries. It is related in some ways also to the classification of environmental services. So many members do not keep statistics in relation to the category of environmental services. So these are definitely challenges in the debate on environmental services, and explain to some extent why discussions have not progressed as much as, for instance, the discussions on environmental goods.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Pellin. Well, maybe Mr. Ria can also offer some observation from New Zealand's perspective, since you've engaged in many negotiations on environmental services on behalf of New Zealand, whether you have encountered difficulties such as this and how you try to overcome such issues.
Thank you. And yes, trade statistics, and particularly in relation to environmental services, has been a significant challenge, and it is difficult to get access to statistics that accurately cover what the state of play in global trade is, and this is particularly difficult in relation to the emerging technologies and trade via cross-border or Mode 1, and that's something that is quite difficult. So New Zealand has recognised that this is a challenge, and our main approach in some attempt to get around this has been to talk to domestic industries to find out what work they're doing, and particularly what work they're doing outside of New Zealand. But again, this is more anecdotal evidence than hard trade statistics. So while it is a challenge, we are trying to find ways around that, but yes, it has been difficult. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe these difficulties will probably be even more daunting in developing countries where the resources are even more insufficient. Thank you for your answer. The next question is directed at Dr. Tsai. In your slide 4, you mentioned that planning and construction and constructing the carbon reduction capacity of the competent authority of the service industry. Can you share some of the capacity building programs for service industry to reduce carbon reduction? Does the Taiwan government have a timetable for establishing carbon pricing instruments? Dr. Tai, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Since Taiwan is an export-oriented country, and our carbon emissions per capita is about 11 tons per capita, which is similar as the average of OECD. It's because most of the carbon emissions comes from the manufacture and the energy sectors. So when we talk about the service industries, I think that now we have a carbon emission inventory program with Taiwan EPA and the MOEA first, and then we will encourage the enterprises to have their carbon disclosures, and which is we are organized by the FSC programs. And when we're talking about the carbon pricing, and now we are amending our Greenhouse Gas Emission and the Reduction Act, and we are planning to have the carbon levy which will start 2023 as soon as possible. I think this is our time schedule.
Okay, thank you very much for first of all laying out the assistance provided by the government to help the service industry to, for example, to report and report their greenhouse gas emissions and to disclose certain data, as well as to give a schedule for carbon pricing instruments, which might start in 2023. You were just mentioning 2023?
Yes.
That's the temporary schedule at the moment.
Mm-hmm. The temporary.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. And the last question addressed both to Mr. Ria and Dr. Tsai. When conducting stakeholder consultation, how do you respond to industry's complaints about their increased costs resulting from required emission reduction? I believe the questions are addressed as both of you would have to deal with stakeholder issues when policy are implemented that relates to climate change mitigation. So for Mr. Ria and for Dr. Tai. So Dr. Tai, you can have the floor first, and then we give the floor to Mr. Ria.
Yeah, I think the carbon emissions comes from the manufacturer, and the EPA organized many discussions with different parties since last year. The negotiations and the awareness of the carbon reduction and the carbon neutral is the way they have to prepare. And so the EPA have many. I think EPA will discuss with the many enterprises and different parties. It's the community and the communities.
So more communication, more communication and persuasion to the stakeholders.
Yes.
Okay. And Mr. Ria, please.
Thank you. Unfortunately, this is not a topic I will be able to provide any real comments on. My role is seeking to expand the liberalisation of trade and environmental services. So a lot of my stakeholder engagement is with those environmental services industries. So I haven't been involved in any other stakeholder engagements, unfortunately. So I won't be able to provide comments there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, that's good for you from a certain perspective. And the next question is addressed to Professor Yang. How can services assist manufacturers to react to EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism rules? Professor Yang, please.
Thank you. I think firstly very much in assembling the data on the degree of subsidies and prices around the world and how they vary. And I think, as I suggested in my talk, the idea of trying to work out carbon subsidy equivalents is particularly important, as countries are taking such a huge array of different approaches to try and reduce emissions, and finding a uniform way to bring that together so we can have a rational discussion globally about the effects on trade of all of these different approaches is critically important. That could be led by the OECD or World Trade Organization or lots of other groups. Trialing it somewhere, developing the methodology, and then taking it global is a massive undertaking, but critically important.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Yan. It's really a difficult question because most of the carbon pricing initiative worldwide are addressed mainly at the goods sector rather than at the services sector. So I believe that international trade rules that relates to similar border adjustment measures are there, but they have been criticized as not being flexible enough. That's also one of the point that Professor Yang was mentioning, that maybe trade rules have been perceived as a little bit unfriendly before. But I think the carbon pricing initiative is, well, especially the one that the EU is pushing forward at the moment, really achieve some of its objective, not in the perspective of leveling the playing field, but from the perspective of raising awareness of the importance of carbon pricing initiative in the exporting countries. I believe that it helps to raise the overall climate change mitigation ambitions worldwide. So I think the service sectors and how the services sectors will interact with the carbon border adjustment scheme like the EU's, or even on the carbon pricing initiative, are still worth analysis, because we haven't seen similar carbon pricing scheme that are imposed on services. I think that's most of, we have addressed most of the questions that are raised by our online audiences. So it's my turn for posing my own questions, because after hearing all these excellent presentations, I will really be very interested in hearing your views on actually what can services or the service industry react to the challenges of climate change? Well, this is a big question, because I believe different sectors will have different way of reacting to climate change challenges, or even they might have new opportunities in terms of industrial technology development or so. So from, because all of you are from work on different areas, from multilateral perspective, from national perspective, from policy maker perspective, and also from a different sectoral approach. So maybe it's also a way of summarizing up what's your view on our main topic of this presentation, the role and opportunities of services in the climate change era. So if all of our panelists can give a very brief view on that. Thank you very much. Ms. Pellin?
My presentation focused particularly on the green services and that in part of the services industry. So just to reiterate that the ongoing discussions could lead to some outcomes that would create opportunities for service suppliers in that area, and with the creation of this multi-stakeholder dialogue in the context of discussions on trade and environmental sustainability, there is really an opportunity to be seized also to share, to take position, for industry groups to take position and share views and concerns with respect to their ability to access foreign markets in exporting relevant services and goods.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Mr. Ria, please.
Thank you. And I think, like everything, services will have to adapt to the new future in order to be able to address climate change issues. And I think we potentially are seeing the shift towards more climate-friendly services industries, and a change in how a lot of services sectors are operating in terms of attempting to become more climate friendly. And we certainly see efforts in transport sectors and energy sectors that are shifting away from the use of fossil fuels and towards greener forms of transport and energy. So I think that's my my view on that is that everything will inevitably have to shift, and services will have to be a part of that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Dr. Tai, please.
Yeah. Net zero emission is a very big challenges for all of the countries, and I think we need to work with all sectors of society, not only to draw up a roadmap, but also to implement and step by step to development and assess the risk earlier. So I think we have to have the energy transformation and the social transformation, and we also have to the behavior change to all of the peoples here, and to start the reduce the carbon emissions. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Dr. Tai. Professor Yang, please.
I think the last comment I'd make is that the biggest service that to the world that can be offered by the trading community is emission reduction. And to understand and work through that is critically important, and anything that we can do to help the world reduce emissions is the greatest contribution we can make to the environment.
Mm-hmm. That's indeed very essential message that this panel convey. While there are many research that are still needed to clarify, for example, the scope and classification of environmental related or climate change related services. Once that is done, we could offer more market access commitments through either multilateral or regional trade agreement that would help each countries to gain access for climate change or environmental related goods and services. And most important is that climate change would affect all different stakeholders and all different industries. So I believe the message is also is clear that engagement with all the stakeholders are very crucial, whether they are at the international level or at the national level. So with that, I conclude with my remark, and I would like to thank all my four panelists. You've done an excellent presentation, and thank you very much for taking up the questions from the floor and for accepting the invitation here from Taiwan. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.